In the vibrant spring of 2016, New York City pulsed with its usual frenetic energy, and amidst the clamor of honking taxis and bustling sidewalks, 18-year-old Tyler Reed found his footing as a new fitness instructor at FitZone, a modest gym nestled in the heart of Brooklyn. The season had painted the borough with bursts of green, as trees along the brownstone-lined streets unfurled their leaves, and the air carried a faint promise of warmth beneath the city's ever-present hum. Tyler, fresh out of high school and brimming with a cocksure attitude, stepped into the gym with the swagger of someone who knew he could turn heads. His youthful energy, paired with a disarming smile and an athletic build honed by years of pickup basketball and makeshift workouts, made him an instant standout among the gym's staff. FitZone sat unassumingly between a bodega and a laundromat, its exterior marked by a weathered sign that flickered faintly at night. Inside, the space was a no-frills affair, scuffed linoleum floors, rows of slightly dented weight racks, and mirrors streaked with years of sweat and determination. It wasn't the kind of place that drew the Instagram fitness crowd or the wealthy elite of Manhattan. Instead, it catered to an eclectic mix of locals, blue-collar workers, students, and retirees, who valued its affordability and proximity. The gym buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk, the clatter of dumbbells and the whir of treadmills forming a steady soundtrack. Tyler adapted quickly, learning the rhythms of the place and carving out a niche as the instructor who could make even the most grueling sessions feel approachable. Among the regulars, a particular group of women over 40 began to catch his attention. They arrived at different times, each with her own routine, but they shared a quiet intensity that set them apart from the younger clientele. Loretta Davis was one of them, a woman whose presence carried the weight of loss. Her husband had passed away 4 years earlier after a prolonged battle with illness, leaving her adrift in a life that felt too large for one person. She showed up at FitZone in the early mornings, dressed in simple workout clothes that hung loosely on her frame, her hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She moved through her exercises with a methodical focus, as if each rep could push back the silence that awaited her at home. Tyler noticed her tentative glances, the way she seemed to linger near the water fountain when he was around, and he began offering her small pointers, adjusting her grip on the weights or suggesting a stretch, watching as her guarded expression softened in response. Margaret King entered the gym with a different air, one of unshakable authority. A businesswoman who had climbed the ranks of a midtown marketing firm, she treated her workouts like a boardroom negotiation, strategic, precise, and non-negotiable. She arrived in the late afternoons, her tailored blazer swapped for high-end activewear, her posture impeccable even as she powered through cardio circuits. The gym was less about vanity for her and more about maintaining the image she'd spent decades crafting, a woman who could outpace anyone, in heels or sneakers. Tyler caught her eye during his first week, his confidence mirroring her own in a way that piqued her interest. She started seeking him out for advice, her questions sharp and probing, and he met her intensity with a playful edge, sensing an opportunity in her approving nods and lingering stares. Celeste Wilson rounded out the trio, her visits tinged with a fragility that drew Tyler in like a moth to a flame. Her divorce had been finalized the previous fall, a bitter end to a marriage that had frayed over years of unmet expectations. She came to FitZone in the evenings, often just as the after-work crowd thinned out, her movements hesitant as she navigated the unfamiliar terrain of weight machines and yoga mats. Her eyes carried a quiet sadness, but they lit up when Tyler approached, his casual encouragement coaxing her into longer sessions. She had chosen the gym on a whim, hoping to rebuild not just her body but the confidence her ex-husband had chipped away, and Tyler became a beacon in that slow, unsteady process. He lingered after her workouts, tossing out light-hearted comments about the weather or the Knicks, and she clung to those moments, unaware of how deftly he read her longing. Tyler thrived in this environment, the gym's fluorescent lights casting him as the star of his own small world. He moved between the women with a chameleon-like ease, tailoring his approach to their needs. For Loretta, he offered a steady presence, listening as she spoke of her husband's old jazz records or the stray cat she'd started feeding, his nods masking the calculations behind his attentiveness. With Margaret, he upped the ante, pushing her through tougher routines and matching her wit, reveling in the way she sized him up like a worthy adversary. For Celeste, he softened his edges, his voice warm and reassuring as he guided her through basic lifts, her shy smiles fueling his sense of control. The spring days stretched into weeks, the city's rhythm pulsing outside as cherry blossoms drifted past the gym's grimy windows. His life felt like a well-oiled machine in those early months. The job paid enough to cover his share of a cramped apartment in Bed-Stuy, the women's attention stroked his ego, and the ease with which he juggled their affections convinced him he was untouchable. He spent his mornings coaching a mix of clients, gruff retirees and harried moms, his afternoons flirting with the trio, and his nights unwinding with cheap beer and friends at a dive bar near the subway. Brooklyn thrummed around him, its streets alive with music and chatter, while inside Fit Zone, the air grew heavy with unspoken possibilities. Tyler didn't pause to consider the threads he was weaving, the delicate balance he'd struck between charm and manipulation. He assumed he could keep it all spinning, Loretta's quiet devotion, Margaret's commanding interest, Celeste's fragile trust, without ever tipping the scales. But the spring of 2016 was merely the opening act, and the city's restless energy held a warning he couldn't yet hear. As the spring of 2016 melted into the muggy embrace of summer, New York City's relentless energy intensified, and Tyler Reed found himself sinking deeper into the intricate web he had spun at Fit Zone. The gym's fluorescent glow became a backdrop to his growing entanglement with Loretta Davis, Margaret King, and Celeste Wilson, each relationship a carefully tended thread in his hands. The days grew longer, the Brooklyn streets shimmering with heat rising off the asphalt, and Tyler's confidence swelled alongside the humidity that clung to the air. With Loretta, his evenings took on a quiet rhythm that unfolded after the gym's peak hours had passed. She lingered after her morning sessions, her presence a subtle invitation he'd come to recognize, and he began meeting her once the last of the clients had trickled out. They slipped away to dimly lit cafes a few blocks from Fit Zone, places with chipped formica tables and the faint hum of old jukeboxes, where the noise of the city dulled to a murmur. Other times, they retreated to her modest brownstone apartment, a space cluttered with faded photographs and the lingering scent of lavender candles. There, Loretta opened up about her past, her husband's knack for fixing anything mechanical, the way he'd whistle old Motown tunes while tinkering in the garage. Tyler sat across from her on a sagging couch, his posture relaxed, his eyes fixed on her with a practiced attentiveness that masked his disinterest. He nodded at the right moments, letting her words wash over him, knowing that his presence alone kept her tethered to him. Margaret's world, by contrast, pulled Tyler into an orbit of luxury that stood in stark opposition to the gym's gritty charm. She had taken to summoning him beyond the confines of Fit Zone, her invitations arriving via crisp text messages that left little room for refusal. By midsummer, he found himself crossing the East River to meet her in Manhattan, where she booked tables at upscale restaurants with names he could barely pronounce. The dining rooms gleamed with polished wood and soft lighting, the clink of wine glasses and murmur of affluent patrons a far cry from Brooklyn's rough edges. Margaret arrived in tailored dresses that shifted to workout gear only when necessity demanded, her demeanor as commanding over a plate of seared scallops as it was on the treadmill. She showered Tyler with gifts, designer watches that felt heavy on his wrist, sleek tracksuits he wore with a mix of pride and unease, each item a tether she wove to bind him closer. He accepted them with a grin, leaning into her need to possess, and she interpreted his easy acceptance as loyalty, blind to the game he played. Celeste sought something quieter, her connection with Tyler unfolding in the shadows of secrecy. She preferred encounters that kept them away from prying eyes, and by July, their meetings had settled into a pattern of late-night escapes. They wandered through Prospect Park as dusk settled over the city, the paths lined with oaks and the distant hum of traffic fading into the background. Other times, they sat in her beat-up sedan, parked in empty lots near the gym, the windows cracked to let in the warm night air. She poured out her fears there, her ex-husband's cold indifference, the years she'd spent shrinking herself to fit his expectations, her voice trembling as she laid bare her wounds. Tyler listened, his head tilted in a way that suggested empathy, though his mind often drifted to the next day's schedule. To Celeste, he represented a lifeline, a chance to feel seen after years of invisibility, and she clung to his every gesture, mistaking his calculated warmth for something genuine. Tyler reveled in the spoils of their attention, each woman feeding a different facet of his desires. Loretta's care wrapped him in a comfort he hadn't known he craved, her homemade meals and gentle fussing a balm to his restless spirit. Margaret's largesse elevated him, the weight of her gifts a tangible measure of his worth, and he strutted through FitZone with a swagger borrowed from her world. Celeste's devotion stroked his ego most of all, her quiet adoration a mirror to his own self-image, and he basked in the power he held over her fragile heart. He juggled them with a finesse honed by instinct, crafting excuses as easily as he lifted weights, late shifts for Loretta, client meetings for Margaret, family obligations for Celeste. Each lie slipped from him smoothly, preserving the illusion that each woman was his sole focus. But the summer heat brought cracks to the surface. Margaret noticed first, her sharp mind attuned to shifts in patterns. Tyler's responses to her calls grew sporadic, his texts shorter than the novels she'd grown accustomed to, and a flicker of doubt crept into her calculations. She watched him more closely at the gym, her eyes narrowing as he moved between clients, searching for signs she couldn't yet name. Loretta felt it too, a distance that widened with each passing week. His nods grew mechanical during their evenings, his attention drifting mid-story, and she began to wonder if the connection she'd built in her mind was one-sided. Celeste's suspicions simmered beneath her hesitance, her intuition whispering that something was off. She caught the way his gaze sometimes darted away, the excuses piling up like leaves in the park, and a quiet dread took root in her chest. Tyler remained oblivious to the fraying edges of his control. The gym's mirrors reflected a version of himself he adored, young, untouchable, the architect of his own small empire. He spent his days striding between weight racks and cardio machines, his nights slipping between the women's worlds, and his confidence blinded him to the tension coiling beneath the surface. Brooklyn pulsed around him, the summer sun baking the streets into a haze of noise and motion, while inside FitZone, the air thickened with unspoken stakes. He didn't see the threads unraveling, didn't hear the faint creak of the structure he'd built. To him, the game was still his to win, and the summer of 2016 stretched ahead like an endless playground. By August 2016, the sultry New York summer had settled into a rhythm of oppressive heat and restless nights, and the cracks in Tyler Reed's carefully constructed world began to widen at FitZone. The gym hummed with its usual cacophony, weights clanking, sneakers squeaking against the floor, the low drone of fans battling the humidity, but beneath the surface, the dynamics shifted in ways Tyler couldn't yet grasp. The threads he'd woven with Loretta Davis, Margaret King, and Celeste Wilson tightened around him, each woman's growing attachment pulling against his calculated detachment. Loretta's feelings had deepened over the months, her evenings with Tyler becoming a lifeline she clung to with quiet desperation. She spent her days replaying their moments together, the way he'd lean against her kitchen counter as she cooked, his laughter filling the empty spaces of her home. By early August, she'd convinced herself that he could be more than a fleeting presence, a chance to reclaim the stability she'd lost years ago. One humid night, as they sat on her worn porch steps, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine from a neighbor's yard, she took a leap. She suggested he move in with her, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, envisioning a life where his gym bag sat permanently by her door. Tyler froze, his mind racing for an escape. He wasn't ready for that kind of anchor, not when his freedom was the fuel for his games. He brushed her off with a vague excuse about needing space to figure things out, his smile tight as he avoided her searching gaze. Loretta nodded, masking her hurt, but the seed of doubt took root, gnawing at the trust she'd placed in him. Margaret, meanwhile, had grown restless, her sharp instincts picking up on the subtle shifts in Tyler's behavior. She'd built her career on reading people, and the young instructor's absences began to chafe at her need for control. He'd started declining her dinner invitations more often, citing extra shifts or exhaustion, and his once prompt replies to her texts now trickled in hours late. She didn't buy his excuses, her mind turning over possibilities like a chess player plotting moves. By mid-August, she took matters into her own hands, adjusting her schedule to linger near FitZone during his closing shifts. One evening, as the sun dipped below Brooklyn's skyline, casting long shadows across the street, she parked her sleek sedan a block away and watched. She saw Tyler emerge from the gym's back door, his silhouette unmistakable, and beside him walked a woman, too far to identify, her features blurred by distance and dusk. Margaret's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her pulse quickening. She couldn't be sure who it was, but the sight fueled a simmering suspicion that her hold on him was slipping. Celeste felt the change too, though her approach was softer, more tentative. The late-night meetings that had once steadied her now carried an undercurrent of unease. Tyler's warmth had cooled, his attention drifting even as they sat shoulder to shoulder in her car, the city's lights flickering beyond the windshield. She noticed how his replies grew clipped, his excuses piling up. He'd been too tired, too busy, too distracted. Her heart ached with the fear that she was losing him, the one person who'd made her feel visible again. One sticky evening in Prospect Park, as crickets chirped in the underbrush, she summoned the courage to press him. She asked why he seemed so distant, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes pleading for reassurance. Tyler waved it off, his tone light but firm, insisting she was the only one who mattered to him. He flashed that familiar grin, the one that had once melted her doubts, but this time it didn't reach her. She retreated into silence, unconvinced, her mind churning with questions she didn't dare voice. While the women wrestled with their unease, a new figure entered the fray at FitZone. Kevin Brown, a lanky 25-year-old with a chip on his shoulder, had joined the staff as a part-time trainer in late July. He'd crossed paths with Tyler before, their brief encounters at local basketball courts marked by a quiet rivalry, Kevin's steady work ethic clashing with Tyler's flashy charisma. At the gym, Kevin watched Tyler with a mix of disdain and curiosity, irked by the way he strutted through the space like he owned it. He'd overheard the whispers among clients, the way women lingered around Tyler's sessions, and it didn't sit right with him. By August, Kevin started paying closer attention, noting how Tyler's schedule seemed to bend around certain hours, how he'd slip out the back door after closing. Sensing something off, Kevin decided to dig deeper, driven by a blend of jealousy and a hunch that Tyler's Golden Boy act hid something worth exposing. He kept his observations to himself, biding his time, his presence a shadow Tyler didn't yet notice. The air around FitZone grew heavier as August wore on, the summer heat pressing against the gym's walls like a physical force. Tyler moved through it all with his usual swagger, coaching clients by day, slipping into the women's lives by night, his confidence unshaken. He didn't see Loretta's quiet withdrawal, the way her steps slowed as she left the gym, her mind replaying his evasion. He missed Margaret's calculating stare, the way she lingered in the parking lot, her phone buzzing with unanswered messages. He overlooked Celeste's faltering trust, the way her shoulders slumped as she drove away from their meetings. And he remained blind to Kevin's watchful eyes, the new trainer's growing resolve to unravel his secrets. Brooklyn thrummed with life outside, street vendors hawking iced drinks, kids racing bikes down cracked sidewalks, but inside the gym, an invisible tension coiled tighter. Tyler played his role as if the script would never change, unaware that the stage was tilting beneath him, the summer of 2016 edging closer to a breaking point he couldn't foresee. On September 15, 2016, the air in Brooklyn hung thick with the last gasps of summer, the evening sky streaked with orange as the sun dipped below the skyline. The tension that had been simmering at FitZone reached its boiling point, and Loretta Davis felt it in every fiber of her being. Her doubts about Tyler Reed had festered since his evasion on her porch, gnawing at her until they became an unbearable ache. She couldn't shake the image of his tight smile, the way he'd brushed off her offer like it meant nothing. That night, driven by a restless need for answers, she pulled on a dark jacket and made her way to the gym. She knew Tyler often stayed late, tidying up after the last clients left, and the thought of catching him off guard fueled her steps. The streets of Bed-Stuy buzzed faintly with distant car horns and the chatter of late-night walkers, but Loretta's focus narrowed to the gym's slouched silhouette as she approached. She slipped through the service entrance Tyler had once shown her, a rusted door tucked behind a dumpster that creaked faintly under her touch. The gym was quiet, the usual clamor of weights and treadmills replaced by an eerie stillness. Her sneakers patted softly against the concrete floor as she navigated the dim hallway, her breath shallow, her pulse thudding in her ears. From the main workout room, muffled sounds drifted toward her, a low murmur, a faint laugh. She edged closer, her body pressed against the wall, until she reached the threshold. Peering around the corner, she saw Tyler perched on a bench press, his posture relaxed, a dumbbell resting idly in his hand. Beside him sat Margaret King, her hand resting casually on his shoulder, her laughter cutting through the silence like a blade. Loretta's breath caught as Tyler leaned in, his lips meeting Margaret's in a kiss that lingered just long enough to shatter everything Loretta had built in her mind. The sight hit her like a physical blow, her hopes crumbling into dust, replaced by a searing mix of betrayal and rage. She retreated into the shadows, her hands trembling, her mind racing with a plan she hadn't fully formed. She left unnoticed, the gym's stillness swallowing her exit as she melted back into the night. The next evening, September 16th, found Loretta retracing her steps, her resolve hardened into something cold and unyielding. The day had passed in a blur, her thoughts consumed by the image of Tyler and Margaret, the casual intimacy that mocked every moment she'd spent with him. She returned to FitZone under a sky bruised with clouds, the air heavy with the threat of rain. The service door yielded to her touch once more, and she stepped inside, her movements deliberate, her jacket zipped tight against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The gym was empty save for Tyler, who stood near the weight racks, his back to her as he methodically stacked equipment. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the room, and the faint scent of sweat and rubber hung in the air. Loretta paused in the doorway, her chest tight, her hands clenched at her sides. She called out his name, her voice sharp and unsteady, cutting through the quiet like a crack of thunder. Tyler turned, his face lighting up with that familiar, easy smile, the one that had once warmed her but now felt like a taunt. He set down a barbell and stepped toward her, his posture loose, unsuspecting. Loretta's anger spilled out, her accusations tumbling forth in a rush, his lies, his betrayal, the way he'd toyed with her heart. Her voice shook, rising with each word, her hands gesturing wildly as she laid bare the pain he'd caused. Tyler didn't flinch, his calm unshaken, his eyes glinting with amusement. He shrugged off her words, his tone dismissive as he admitted she'd never been more than a piece in his game, a passing amusement he'd grown tired of. His mockery was the final spark, igniting the fury that had simmered within her since the night before. Her gaze darted to the floor, landing on a stray dumbbell, its metal surface glinting dully under the lights. In an instant, her hand closed around it, the weight cold and heavy against her palm. She stepped forward, her movements fueled by a rage that drowned out reason, and swung the dumbbell with all her strength. It connected with Tyler's head in a sickening thud, the sound reverberating off the gym's mirrored walls. His body crumpled instantly, his legs buckling as he collapsed to the floor, a dark pool of blood spreading beneath him. The dumbbell slipped from Loretta's grasp, clattering against the concrete, and she stumbled back, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with shock. Tyler lay motionless, his chest still, the life drained from him in a single, irreversible moment. Loretta stood frozen, her hands trembling, her mind struggling to process the reality of what she'd done. The gym's silence pressed in around her, broken only by the faint drip of blood pooling beneath the weight racks, a stark testament to the line she'd crossed. The silence that followed Tyler Reed's collapse shattered abruptly as the service door creaked open, admitting Celeste Wilson into FitZone's dim expanse on that fateful September 16th evening. She had come with the quiet hope of catching Tyler after his shift, her heart buoyed by the thought of their usual late-night escape. Her footsteps faltered as she crossed the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the harsh glow of the gym's lights, only to land on a scene that stopped her cold. Tyler lay sprawled on the floor, a dark stain spreading beneath his head, while Loretta Davis stood over him, the dumbbell still clutched in her trembling hand. Celeste's breath hitched, her mind struggling to process the horror before her. Panic surged through her veins, overriding any instinct to speak or act, and she turned on her heel, fleeing back through the door she'd entered. Her sneakers pounded the pavement outside, her ragged gasps lost to the night as she vanished into the Brooklyn streets, leaving the gym behind without a sound. Loretta remained rooted to the spot, the weight of Celeste's sudden appearance crashing over her like a wave. The realization that she'd been seeing jolted her from her stupor, her gaze darting between Tyler's lifeless form and the door through which Celeste had fled. Her pulse raced, a frantic drumbeat urging her to act before the consequences caught up. She dropped the dumbbell, its dull clang echoing in the empty space, and fumbled for her phone with shaking hands. Her mind latched onto Margaret King, the one person she knew could handle a crisis with cold precision. Margaret's commanding nature and her deep aversion to public disgrace made her the perfect ally in this spiraling nightmare. Loretta's call connected after a single ring, her pleas tumbling out in a breathless rush as she begged for help, her voice cracking with desperation. Margaret, though stunned by the gravity of what she heard, didn't hesitate long. The fear of her own entanglement with Tyler being exposed outweighed her shock, and within minutes, she was steering her sedan toward FitZone, her jaw set with grim determination. Margaret arrived under the cover of a moonless sky, her headlights cutting through the darkness as she pulled into the alley behind the gym. She stepped inside through the same self-service entrance, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete, her presence a stark contrast to the chaos Loretta had unleashed. She surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, Tyler's body crumpled near the weight racks, the blood pooling beneath him, Loretta hovering nearby, pale and disheveled. Margaret's mind raced, calculating the risks, and she quickly seized control. She proposed framing Celeste, her logic ruthless and swift. The woman's panicked flight could be spun as an admission of guilt, a perfect scapegoat for the mess they faced. Loretta nodded, too rattled to argue, her hands twisting nervously as Margaret took charge. The two women set to work, their movements hurried but deliberate. Margaret grabbed a rag from a nearby shelf, wiping the dumbbell's handle with meticulous care, erasing Loretta's fingerprints from its surface. She placed it back on the rack, aligning it with the others as if it had never been disturbed. Loretta, meanwhile, attacked the blood on the floor, scrubbing at the sticky mess with a towel she'd found in the locker room, her strokes frantic but uneven. They overturned a bench and shifted a few weights, staging the scene to suggest a struggle had taken place, a clumsy fight that could point to Celeste's involvement. The gym's mirrored walls reflected their efforts, casting distorted shadows that danced across the room as they worked. In their haste, they missed critical details. A few crimson droplets clung to the hem of Loretta's jacket, unnoticed in the dim light, and the faint imprint of her sneakers streaked the floor near the bloodstain, a silent testament to her presence. Unbeknownst to them, Kevin Brown lingered in the shadows of the gym's storage room, his shift having stretched late as he restocked towels and cleaned equipment. The muffled thud of the dumbbell striking Tyler had drawn his attention earlier, a sound that pricked his curiosity enough to pause his work. He'd crept toward the door, peering through the narrow gap just as Margaret arrived, catching sight of the two women as they scrubbed and rearranged the scene. His breath caught in his throat, his body tensing as he pieced together the gravity of what he'd stumbled upon. Fear held him back. He didn't dare step out, didn't trust himself to confront them, but his presence loomed like an unseen threat, a witness they didn't know they had. He retreated deeper into the storage room, pressing himself against a stack of mats, his mind racing with what he'd seen and what it might mean. Loretta and Margaret finished their task as the clock neared midnight, the gym now a carefully staged tableau of deception. They stepped back, surveying their handiwork, the overturned bench, the scattered weights, the clean dumbbell gleaming innocently on its rack. Margaret wiped her hands on her trousers, her composure regained, while Loretta's shoulders slumped, exhaustion and guilt warring within her. They slipped out through the service door, the night swallowing them as they parted ways, Margaret to her car, Loretta on foot, her jacket pulled tight against the chill. They left convinced that Celeste would bear the blame, her flight from the scene a damning thread they tied around her. The gym stood silent once more, its secrets locked within its walls, the bloodstains muted but not erased, and Kevin's unseen eyes the only crack in their fragile plan. The morning of September 17, 2016 dawned gray and heavy over Brooklyn, the city stirring slowly as the first rays of light crept through the borough's tightly packed buildings. FitZone remained silent until the early shift arrived, a pair of bleary-eyed employees unlocking the front door just after 7. They stepped inside, expecting the usual quiet of a Saturday morning, but their routine shattered when they spotted Tyler Reed's body sprawled near the weight racks, the blood beneath him now congealed into a dark, sticky pool. One of them froze, her hand clutching the keys, while the other fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. Within 20 minutes, NYPD officers flooded the gym, their boots tracking dirt across the linoleum, their radios crackling with clipped updates. The scene puzzled them at first. The overturned bench and scattered weights suggested an accident, a freak mishap with the equipment, but the blood's volume and the odd angles of the chaos hinted at something darker. Detectives arrived shortly after, their coats damp from a light drizzle that had begun to fall outside. They cordoned off the gym with yellow tape, the harsh morning light filtering through the windows to illuminate the grisly tableau. Word of Celeste Wilson's presence the previous night surfaced quickly. One of the employees recalled seeing her car lingering nearby, and a patrol unit tracked her down at her small apartment a few miles away. They found her curled on her couch, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. She didn't resist when they brought her in, her body trembling as she sat in a sterile interview room at the precinct. She admitted she'd been at FitZone, her voice barely above a whisper, but insisted she hadn't touched Tyler, that she'd fled in terror after stumbling upon his body. The discovery of her fingerprints on the dumbbell, planted there by Loretta and Margaret, tightened the noose around her, and the detectives leaned hard, pegging her as the prime suspect in what they now classified as a homicide. The investigation gained momentum as the day wore on, the drizzle outside turning into a steady rain that streaked the precinct's windows. Uniformed officers canvassed the area around FitZone, while forensic techs combed the gym, bagging evidence and snapping photos of the blood splatter and displaced equipment. A breakthrough came when they reviewed footage from a grainy street camera mounted on a nearby bodega. It captured Margaret King's sedan pulling into the alley behind the gym just before midnight, her figure unmistakable as she stepped out and disappeared through the service door. The timestamp didn't align with Celeste's panicked exit, and the detectives' focus shifted, a thread of doubt unraveling their initial theory. Meanwhile, Kevin Brown wrestled with his conscience from the shadows. He'd spent the night replaying what he'd seen, Loretta and Margaret's frantic cleanup, the way they'd moved with purpose, and by midday, guilt outweighed his fear. He slipped into a payphone down the street from his apartment, his hood pulled low, and left an anonymous tip with the precinct, his voice low as he reported 2 women in the gym after hours. The case cracked open further in the following weeks, the rain giving way to crisp October air as the detectives dug deeper. A search of Loretta Davis's home turned up her jacket, carelessly tossed into a hamper, its hem stained with dried flecks of Tyler's blood. Forensic analysis confirmed the match, a damning link that shifted the spotlight onto her. The gym's floor yielded more, a faint sneaker print near the bloodstain, its size and tread inconsistent with Celeste's shoes, but matching a pair found in Loretta's closet. Margaret's alibi crumbled when confronted with the camera footage. She claimed a late-night errand, but her evasions rang hollow against the evidence piling up. By mid-October, the puzzle pieces locked into place, Loretta as the killer, her rage-fueled strike the fatal blow, and Margaret as her accomplice, orchestrating the cover-up to shield her own secrets. The arrests came swiftly, squad cars rolling up to Loretta's brownstone and Margaret's sleek condo on the same gray afternoon. Loretta surrendered without a fight, her face blank as officers cuffed her wrists, the weight of her actions settling into her bones. Margaret resisted, her voice sharp with indignation as she demanded her lawyer, but the evidence silenced her protests. At the precinct, their stories fractured. Loretta pinned the cleanup on Margaret's insistence, while Margaret accused Loretta of dragging her into the mess, each desperate to shift the blame. The interrogations stretched late into the night, the detectives watching as the women's alliance crumbled under pressure. By March 2017, the trial reached its end in a packed Brooklyn courtroom, the air thick with anticipation as the jury delivered their verdict after weeks of testimony. Loretta received 20 years for second-degree murder, her sentence reflecting the impulsive fury of her act, her expression stoic as the gavel fell. Margaret got 8 years for conspiracy and evidence tampering, her role in the aftermath deemed calculated but secondary, her shoulders slumping as she stared at the floor. Celeste, cleared of all charges, slipped away from the city soon after, her belongings packed into a U-Haul as she fled the whispers that clung to her name. The shadow of that night lingered, a scar she couldn't outrun. Kevin quit FitZone days after his tip, the guilt of his silence gnawing at him as he took a job at a warehouse across town. The gym shuttered within months, its windows boarded up, its name fading from the neighborhood's memory. Tyler's story morphed into a grim urban tale, whispered over beers and stoop chats, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and a bitter aftertaste that settled over Brooklyn like dust.